So, one thing I think we really need to look at is how left wing environmentalism often shoots itself in the foot, which really speaks for the need for a stronger right wing environmentalism. I think that's what we really need. And I'm going to look at some of the ways in which left wing environmentalism ultimately fails because of its own inherent contradictions and hypocrisies. The first is the excessive focus on veganism. Now, I really think the left has allowed vegans to hijack the environmental movement. And I think it's a really big problem because vegans, quite frankly, put a lot of people off, and for good reason. Because they always look emaciated and unhealthy, and they're just really pretentious and full of themselves. And in fact, they say shit that should actually offend other leftists, like when they compare eating animals to slavery. It's like, unironically, Dems are the real racists in that case. So I think veganism, it's just bad optics. Like, vegans are just, they're terrible optics, and they just hijack everything, and they completely derail the entire environmental movement by making it all about animal rights, like the rights of chickens and cows, rather than about the actual environment. And I think by doing that, by creating this misguided focus on veganism, vegan activism in particular, they alienate a lot of people. And furthermore, I do think meat is an important part of the human diet, and I think whatever solution we do find to climate change, taking meat out of the human diet is not it. Some people will become vegan, but a lot of people will refuse to, and frankly, they have good reason, because I don't think veganism is particularly healthy, and especially for people who have certain conditions, like if you have an overly high metabolism, you're going to be even more emaciated. Or if you're like me and you're allergic to most nuts, it's like vegan diets often heavily incorporate nuts. It's like, well, good luck to you if you're allergic to that shit. So it's like, again, there's so many reasons why I think the overemphasizing veganism, it derails the environmental movement, and it alienates people, and it's counterproductive. And as I said before, I mean, it's highly likely that, say, for instance, importing tropical fruits has higher carbon emissions than eating, say, chicken or pork that is raised locally. So again, like, they oversimplify things by saying veganism is better for the environment, when in reality that's not always the case. Like, so again, that's number one, veganism. The second thing I've noticed is that a lot of leftists are willing to completely surrender all their principles the second that feminism comes into the equation, or racism for that matter. Anytime anybody tries to do anything for the environment, but then it's like, wait a second, this could negatively impact people of color or women, then all of a sudden they're no longer willing to support it, even if it's for the greater good. And I think that says something. I think it says that they don't value the environment as much as they value these social justice issues, which is why every time they come into conflict, every time they come into conflict, they always side with social justice. For instance, anytime they try to prioritize public transit above cars, they'll say like, well, some poor people rely on cars. It's like, or they'll specifically say like, people of color rely on cars. And it's like, okay, some do, but it's like, so do some white people. But at the end of the day, if you want to make an omelet, you got to break a few eggs. There's going to be people who will suffer as a result of, anything that requires major societal upheaval. That's just the facts of reality. Sometimes, for the greater good, yes, a few people must suffer, and it's unfair, but that's just the reality of life. Also, one case where I've really seen this is in the case of debates about public transit versus cars, or suburbia versus denser development. A lot of feminists will come in saying, well, I don't feel comfortable on public transit. I feel the male gaze. I don't feel comfortable because there's men on there who are creepy. And it's like, these leftists are so willing to surrender all of their principles the second some woman claims that she's not willing to take transit because she feels there's too many rapey men on it. And it's like, maybe these women do have a point, maybe they're not making it up, but at the same time, I think it's interesting how quickly all these leftists are willing to all automatically believe these women. It's like, okay, aren't you suspicious that at least some of these women are just looking for an excuse to drive an SUV? Because I am. I'm frankly suspicious in at least some of these cases. Now, some of these women may have a point. I mean, sexual harassment on public transit, it does happen. But at the same time, it's like, I think the way they just uncritically accept it is kind of hypocritical, especially considering that, like, you know, if a white man says, I don't want to take transit because I'm worried about getting mugged, they'll be like, oh, you're racist. That's just racism. But the second that a woman says she's afraid of being raped or sexually harassed, they automatically believe that. They automatically believe there's no hidden vested interest there. So it's like, again, like letting social justice issues take precedent over environmental issues, like automatically, I think that's a huge one. The third is one that I've already talked about quite a bit, so I won't talk about it too much here, but the left-wing opposition to nuclear and hydroelectric power. They always tend to make the perfect the enemy of the good, or more accurately, they make the bad the enemy of the good by embracing solar and wind power, which very often don't work. And the reality of that is often more fossil fuels. That's what's happening in Germany. They've rejected nuclear power, and now they're importing natural gas from Russia. Those Russian carbon emissions are actually German carbon emissions, but they're counted as Russian. So, it looks good for Germany. So again, like this whole opposition to nuclear power, it's been well documented that leftists, actually liberals and leftists, oppose nuclear power more than right-wingers do. And in fact, women as a whole oppose nuclear power more than men do. We could see this in Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand proudly proclaimed that she helped make New Zealand nuclear free. It's like, good for you. Now you're making your country more reliant, most likely, on fossil fuels. I would guess so, at least. But anyway, yeah, I've already talked about that a lot, so I'm not going to get into too much more detail here, but the opposition to nuclear and hydroelectric power is a huge way that left-wing environmentalists shoot themselves in the foot. The fourth way is the fact that anytime the subject of overpopulation comes up, a lot of these leftists will automatically say, oh, you're a fascist, you're an eco-fascist, you're a Malthusian, you're just like Hitler, you want genocide. Like, they automatically jump to all these hyperbolic, emotional claims, these smears, and quite frankly, it's counterproductive, it's childish, it's hysterical, but this behavior is very common among leftists and liberals. It's this idea that they're never willing to think about the greater good, and they always jump to like the worst possible conclusion. It's like, oh, you're talking about overpopulation. That must mean that you want to just commit genocide and exterminate huge numbers of people. It's like, no, it doesn't automatically mean that. But at the same time, yeah, they've made it a dirty word, overpopulation, and it's very counterproductive. Again, it shows they're not willing to break a few eggs to make an omelet, a lot of these people. They're unwilling to get anything that would make real change, real difference done, because it upsets them. They can't stomach it. And it's like, again, I'm not saying we have to like commit genocide. I'm not saying we have to go full Thanos or full Raymond Valentine or full, what were those guys in Utopia called? Actually, they were different though, because they wanted to just sterilize people. But anyway, on that subject, I think sterilization is largely the solution to overpopulation. But I think it should primarily target the third world, because those are the ones who are overpopulated. And it should be voluntary rather than forced. I think what it should be done is financial aid should be leveraged in exchange for them agreeing to be sterilized, especially those who've already had 2 children. And I think some people would say, oh, well, that's might as well be forced because you're coercing them with financial incentives. And it's like, fair enough, it is coerced. But at the end of the day, I think we have to do things like that. I don't think there's any way to solve a problem without getting your hands a little bit dirty. And if we have to basically coerce third worlders into voluntary sterilization in order to address the overpopulation problem, then so be it. I'm okay with that. And I think the fact that so many leftists aren't okay with even addressing the issue of overpopulation, they automatically jump to like, oh, you're Hitler, you're fascist, you're Nazi, you're Malthusian, you're racist, you're whatever. Like they automatically jump to these things, and it's like, okay, you're not going to solve the problem with that fucking attitude. You're not going to get anywhere with that attitude. The final thing that I think is counterproductive about left-wing environmentalism is that when it comes to forest management, a lot of them aren't willing to do it. They have this idea that we shouldn't interfere with nature and that any kind of forest management is wrong. But it's like, the issue is we're kind of already interfering with nature by existing and by pumping all this carbon into the air and other fucking nasty forms of pollution. So it's like, if we're already interfering with nature in a negative way by existing, what's so bad with interfering with nature in a positive way in order to help ameliorate the situation? And that includes, for instance, let's say, in some cases, cutting down old trees that are very vulnerable to forest fires, replacing them with younger trees that are less vulnerable. Also replacing them in some cases with species that are less vulnerable, such as aspen trees. And this can be done in conjunction with the logging industry. And again, the logging industry is partly to blame because they actually are against aspen trees being planted. Aspen trees, for those who don't know, they're deciduous trees that are less flammable than coniferous trees. And it's been proven that if you plant a bunch of them, they do reduce forest fires in these coniferous forests. Now, another form of forest management is also controlled burns, which some leftists, they're against that too, many of them, because again, they're like, oh, it's interfering with nature, or they're worried that the controlled burn could cause more problems than it solves. But it's like, no, I would say controlled burns are a net good. Sometimes they go wrong, which is sad, but at the end of the day, they are a net good. Now, that being said, okay, I do support forest management, and I think we need more of it, but at the same time, I think it should vary from one place to another. Like, for instance, I don't think we should be cutting down spruce trees and replacing them with aspen trees right at, like, Lake Louise or Moraine Lake, or somewhere that's, like, a place of natural beauty where the spruce trees are specifically part of the beauty of it. But I think, for instance, in some of the backcountry, some of these, like, mountainous or just forested areas that aren't, like, the main tourist spots, places that maybe aren't even in the national parks at all, or in the backcountry parts of the national parks. Yeah, I think maybe we could be doing this there, because I do think that it's important to mitigate these forest fires because they're getting worse with each passing year. And if that requires human intervention on some levels, then yes, that's a good thing. If we're intervening to hurt nature, why can't we intervene to help nature? And those are my thoughts. And again, there's other solutions too, like, say, for instance, creating fire prevention corridors, which is basically areas of land that are kind of cleared of trees in order to serve as a barrier so that the forest fires won't spread more. There's a lot of different solutions to forest fires. But again, some of these leftists, they make the perfect the enemy of the good. They won't allow for any intervention because they see it as, oh, we're messing with nature. But again, it's a stupid argument because, as I've said, we're already messing with nature. So why not mess with nature in a positive way? So anyway, those are the ways I think that leftist environmentalists shoot themselves and the environmentalist movement as a whole in the foot. Let me know what you think. All right.